43-year-old Jean Domenico was way too positive and upbeat of a person to complain about her life. In fact, optimism, kindness, and generosity, all those were just some of the words that family and friends used to describe Jean. And those qualities were so obvious in Jean's infectious smile, laughing blue eyes, and warm manner that even total strangers who exchanged just a few words with Jean always left those encounters knowing they'd met a very special kind of person. So, when Jean's coworkers passed by her desk at Oxford Health Plans on that hot New England morning in 2003, no one would have suspected that behind Jean's usual smile and cheerful greeting, Jean had been feeling anything but happy and calm. It was Wednesday, August 6th, and the day was shaping up to be one of the hottest on record in Nashua, New Hampshire, where Jean lived with her 2 teenage children. And when Jean had left her house at 7:45 a.m. that morning, she had spent the 30-minute drive to work going over and over in her mind the events of the last 5 days. Even inside of her air-conditioned car, where she felt comfortable and in control of her surroundings, Jean kept wondering if the decision she had come to on Monday, 2 days earlier, was the right decision, or whether it would just cause even more problems for her and her kids. As a single mom who had ended an abusive marriage 4 years earlier, Jean was no stranger to family drama and the strain of financial hardship, and Jean had always chosen to meet those challenges head-on. After leaving the children's father, Anthony Kazinskis, back in 1999, Jean began working 2 to 3 different jobs at once to put food on the table of their small home in one of Nashua's more modest neighborhoods. Even now, with her full-time job at Oxford Health Plans, Jean still worked a part-time shift at a local convenience store. But despite how busy she was, Jean's primary focus had always been her son, Charlie, now 14 years old, and her daughter, Nicole, who had just turned 16 2 months earlier. The 3 of them had always been very close, and now, aside from still sharing their father's last name, Charlie and Nicole spent almost all their time with their mom. And no matter how crazy her schedule was, Jean had always made sure that both children were well looked after when she was at work, and that the neighbors always kept an eye out for her ex-husband. Not only did Anthony owe Jean $11,000 in unpaid child support, but also Jean wanted to guard against the possibility that Anthony would show up unannounced and uninvited at the house when she was not there. But the turmoil Jean was feeling on this particular morning had nothing to do with Anthony or money or anything else that Jean felt like she could fix through hard work and good parenting, 2 things that came naturally to Jean. In fact, it had been Jean's efforts over the last 2 years to help guide Nicole through a difficult adolescence that had seemed to backfire in ways that Jean had just never expected. Driving along the familiar route to work, Jean thought back to Nicole just before she turned 14 and when their lives had seemed a lot simpler. While still in middle school, Nicole had been an outstanding student whose natural shyness had not stopped her from joining the school chorus and bubbling over at home with news about what she was doing and reading. And when Jean had heard other moms talk about the arguments or fights they had with their teenage daughters, Jean had just felt grateful that she and Nicole had always gotten along so well and had always enjoyed doing things and going places together. But when Nicole turned 14 and headed into high school, her shyness turned into awkwardness and intense self-consciousness about her weight and looks. Jean had been heartbroken the evening she found Nicole sitting on the bed in her tiny upstairs room using scissors to cut pictures of herself into pieces, and hearing Nicole describe herself as fat and ugly. After that, it wasn't long before Nicole, who had also dropped out of the school chorus, became the target of bullying. Driving along Interstate 293, Jean gripped the steering wheel more tightly, remembering one incident when a group of girls pulled Nicole's pants down to her ankles, leaving Nicole fully exposed from the waist down to laughter and stares from surrounding students. Jean had gone straight to the school principal when she heard about the incident, but that had not stopped the whispering and teasing. And then, just when Nicole seemed to be sinking into depression, the shy 14-year-old with low self-esteem had met 17-year-old Billy Sullivan in an online chat room. Billy lived 100 miles away in Willimantic, Connecticut, but the popular internet technology called Instant Messenger had allowed the 2 of them to form a close and personal relationship long before they actually ever met in person. And at first, it took Jean a while to connect the improvement in Nicole's mood and confidence to the increasing amount of time Nicole had started spending on the internet. And Jean certainly didn't know that within just 5 days of their virtual meeting, Billy and Nicole had already declared their undying love for one another. It was only when Jean's phone bill blew up with long-distance phone charges for calls from their home at 6 Dumaine Avenue in Nashua, New Hampshire, to a number more than 2 hours south in Connecticut that Jean realized that Nicole had found her first real boyfriend. But what Jean just could not have expected, given the physical distance between Nicole and Billy, was how seriously Nicole and Billy would begin to take their relationship. And when Jean had finally relented and agreed to drive Nicole to Connecticut so Nicole could actually meet Billy for the first time, Jean was certainly not prepared for how hysterical Nicole became when the 8-hour supervised visit ended and Nicole and Jean turned north and headed home to New Hampshire. On one hand, Jean knew that what she was seeing in Nicole was the kind of drama and intensity that only a teenager could bring to first love, and that eventually the relationship would probably play itself out. Especially since Nicole had confided that Billy, for all his declarations of love for Nicole, had at least one other girlfriend, also Nicole's age. And when Nicole and Billy argued, Billy had let it drop that he'd been, quote, forced, his word, to seek comfort with that other girlfriend. On the other hand, Jean also knew that it was just not possible for her to control the feelings and actions of these two young people. And if all Jean did was say no to Nicole and point out flaws in her relationship with Billy, then chances were good that it would be Jean who Nicole would reject, not Billy. So, when Billy had arrived, unannounced and uninvited, at Jean's house that previous Friday, August 1st, Jean had not been pleased, but she had also, reluctantly, allowed him to stay. As Billy explained to Jean, he'd been given a vacation from his job as a line cook at the local McDonald's near his house in Willimantic, and since he'd also just recently gotten his driver's license and a car of his own, he'd wanted to surprise Nicole with an extended visit. Over the entire 15 months that the two had been together, they'd only actually seen one another in person 4 or 5 times, and never for more than just a few days. In agreeing to the visit, Jean had reasoned that at least this way, she would be able to keep a close eye on Nicole and Billy, who were not permitted to spend any time together alone in Nicole's upstairs bedroom. It had not been the most convenient arrangement in the world. Jean's house was a small but traditional cape house, a center front entrance that led into the living and dining rooms to either side, with the kitchen and 2 small bedrooms towards the back. Nicole's bedroom, with its sloped ceiling, was on the second floor, along with an equally tiny bathroom, which meant that when Jean's 14-year-old son, Charlie, wasn't staying over with friends, as he often did, there was no spare bedroom for Billy, and Jean had to tiptoe around Billy, sleeping on the downstairs couch when she got up in the morning to start her day and tidy up the kitchen before leaving for one of her 2 jobs. It wasn't that Billy seemed like a bad kid. He had a steady job at McDonald's. He lived with his single mom and his 4 sisters, but he was not a freeloader. It was clear he loved his family and contributed a regular chunk of his hourly wages to help with household expenses. Tall and lanky, with a military-style buzz cut and dark brown eyes and a smattering of teenage pimples that made him look younger than he really was, he was generally polite and handsome. And Jean had to admit that Billy's frequent declarations about how beautiful and smart and talented Nicole was had, at least in the beginning, done a lot to improve her daughter's self-esteem. Still, Jean was glad the visit was coming to an end, several days sooner than Billy and Nicole had planned, so today was the last day that he and Nicole would have together before Billy returned to Willimantic. The last day, Jean would step outside and see Billy's black Chevrolet Cavalier sitting in their driveway. Just walking by the car that morning on her way to her own car, Jean had thought of that incident at dinner on Sunday, 3 days earlier. Wanting to make Billy feel welcome, Jean had spent the entire afternoon in the kitchen cooking a big dinner for all of them. Jean had been surprised when Billy had looked over the serving dishes and hot food that covered the table that evening and commented that it had been a while since he'd had a complete meal. When Jean had looked up from her plate, saying, "Really?" Billy had interpreted her comment as a veiled insult directed at Billy's own mother, as though Peg Sullivan were not as good a cook or as good of a mother as Jean herself was. Remembering the exchange now, Jean just shook her head. For her, Billy's hostile reaction had set the tone of the whole week, and now she was just glad the visit with Billy would soon be over. Determined to keep that fact uppermost in her thoughts, By the time Jean had arrived at work, she had regained most of her outward good cheer. She was scheduled to spend the day training a new employee, and that was something Jean enjoyed and looked forward to. She liked making sure that new hires felt comfortable and welcome and competent, and the training and orientation materials she'd be using were already neatly organized on Jean's work desk and computer. So, half an hour later, as Jean looked up to greet the new employee, it would have taken a very close observer to notice the faint lines of strain on Jean's otherwise open and smiling face. And throughout the day, that close observer did walk by Jean's desk several times to smile and say hello, but it wasn't until 4:30 on that Wednesday afternoon that Chris McGowan, Jean's fiancé and fellow Oxford Health Plans employee, stopped by long enough to have a real conversation with the woman he loved. Ever since Chris had met Jean on his first day of work 2 years ago, Chris had been completely smitten by this outgoing and friendly woman. A confirmed bachelor whose one long-term relationship had ended in the late 1980s, Chris had not been looking to date anyone, any more than Jean had been. By 2000, Chris, a stocky Irishman with dark hair and a wide smile under his dark mustache, had settled into a comfortable 3-bedroom ranch house as well as a comfortable routine. For her part, Jean was still recovering from her divorce the year before, and all her time and attention was focused on her kids and on paying the bills. And any spare time that she did have, Jean had spent it on activities like coaching Charlie's Little League baseball team or joining the parent-teacher organization when the children went to the Birch Hill Elementary School. But while that initial spark of attraction that Chris and Jean felt for one another had not lit an instantaneous bonfire, it had ignited something much longer lasting. Chris understood and respected Jean's devotion to her kids, and he was careful not to intrude on Charlie and Nicole's time with their mom. Even now, Chris rarely stayed over at Jean's house, except on the weekends, and he was more than happy to wait until both Charlie and Nicole had graduated from high school and begun their own lives before he and Jean got married and lived together. To their respective family and friends, Jean and Chris formed that rare couple who seemed deeply and patiently in love with each other. Although they made a point of keeping their interactions at work very businesslike, Chris never tired of making small gestures that showed how much he cared for Jean, like the bouquet of roses he had delivered to her desk that past Monday. Despite how crowded the Domenico house was now with Billy visiting, Jean had asked Chris to spend as much time there as possible over the last 5 days. Chris got along well with both Charlie and Nicole, and Jean felt better about Nicole and Billy spending so much time together if Chris was also able to keep a watchful eye on both of them. So, Chris knew firsthand the stresses Jean had felt that week, and he also knew that just when Jean felt like she really needed all her energy and stamina, she had experienced a few bouts of dizziness and fatigue over the last 2 days that were just not like her. Chris's first thought was that the dizziness had been the result of the highly restrictive diet that Jean had recently started in an effort to lose several pounds that had added a comfortable roundness to her 5'6" frame. And looking down at Jean now, at the end of yet another workday, he wished he could convince her that she was perfect just as she was, and find some way to erase the tiredness he could see in her eyes. Instead, Chris went over the plan they had agreed on for that evening. He would leave work now, head to his house, shower, check his mail, and do a few household chores, grab some clean clothes, and then meet Jean at 60 Main Street at about 7 or 7:30. That would give Jean plenty of time to stop and pick up the pizza she planned to serve for dinner that night and tidy up the house before Chris arrived. But it wasn't until the end of their conversation, when Chris whispered, "I love you," that Jean really switched out of work mode. Standing up suddenly, her eyes bright with affection, Jean put down her papers and pencil and reached up to give Chris a strong, warm hug. And Chris was still thinking about that hug and Jean's reply as he got into his car a few minutes later and headed south from the small town of Hooksett, where Oxford Health Plans was located, to the much larger city of Nashua, where Chris's house was located just a few miles away from Jean's. At times like this, Chris could understand the thrill of togetherness, whether you were a teenager or a middle-aged insurance broker. When Jean had said, "I love you too," Chris felt like he was the luckiest person in the world. True to his word, Chris arrived at Jean's house at 7:15. He'd called her 3 times since leaving his house at 7 to see if there was anything else she wanted him to pick up for dinner. When all 3 calls went to voicemail, Chris assumed that Jean must be out walking the family's two dogs, and so he stopped just long enough to grab a bottle of soda for the kids. But when Chris stepped out of his car, he could see both dogs still outside in the backyard of Jean's house. Thinking that Jean must have just gotten back from her walk, Chris made his way around to the front, he climbed the steps to the welcome mat, and then came to a sudden stop. The front door was slightly ajar, but inside no lights were on, and the house was eerily quiet. When Jean didn't answer his shouted greeting, "Are you in there, honey?" Chris pushed the door all the way open and stepped inside. As he did so, it occurred to him that the dogs out back had been behaving strangely, whining and turning in circles, their tails tucked tightly between their back legs. His sense of alarm growing by the second, Chris was so focused on finding Jean that he did not even notice the smashed-up coffee table in the living room or the dark liquid that was splashed across the carpet. It was only when he stepped into the kitchen and his eyes followed the thin beam of light from the open refrigerator door as it slanted down to the linoleum tiles that Chris began to register the full horror of what was in front of him. Jean lay face down on the kitchen floor, her head and shoulders swimming in a thick pool of blood. A moment later, Chris was on his knees next to her, shaking her, gently at first, but then much harder, calling her name over and over again and begging her to please just wake up. When the Nashua Police Department and emergency medical personnel heard the call go out from dispatch reporting a, quote, sudden death in one of the city's quietest neighborhoods, it only took minutes for fire trucks, an ambulance, and police cruisers to pull up outside Jean Domenico's house at 6 Dumaine Avenue. With more than 90,000 residents, Nashua might be the second largest city in New Hampshire, but even in a state with one of the lowest homicide rates in the whole country, murder here in Nashua was very rare. So when Chris had called 911 and described a scene of blood everywhere when he discovered his girlfriend's lifeless body, law enforcement had mobilized all of its local resources, blocking off the entrance to Dumaine Avenue, even to residents, stringing up crime scene tape to hold back the growing crowd of concerned neighbors or curious spectators, and also making sure that Chris McGowan, dazed, disoriented, and covered in blood, did not take a single step without a police officer keeping close watch on him. Chris may have told the 911 dispatcher that it looked to him like Jean had had some sort of terrible accident, maybe fainting and hitting her head on a corner of the stove, but police did not have to wait for emergency medical personnel and later the medical examiner to tell them that this was no accident. In fact, it was just the opposite. Jean had been the victim of the most horrific attack that responding officers and detectives had ever seen. And since Chris was the person who had discovered Jean's body, and he was the boyfriend, always a person of interest in homicide cases, he had instantly become the #1 prime suspect, especially when he had no alibi for the time he claimed to have spent at home by himself after work and before finding Jean's body. As the first of Jean's neighbors began gathering outside to ask police what was happening, Chris was bundled into the back seat of a cruiser and driven to the Nashua Police Department headquarters, where he willingly gave police a DNA sample before being taken into an interrogation room for questioning. Meanwhile, over the next several hours, crime scene techs and law enforcement were able to gather a huge amount of information about what had happened earlier that afternoon and evening at the Domenico residence. Chris, along with neighbors who had a clear view of Jean's property, helped police establish that Jean had arrived home from work that afternoon at about 5:30 p.m., carrying boxes of pizza she had picked up from a restaurant called Chow's. Jean had missed her daughter Nicole and Billy by about an hour. The two teenagers had been spotted at 4:30 p.m. playing tag in the Domenico's big backyard before hopping into Billy's car and heading to a local 7-Eleven convenience store, where Billy's black Cavalier was later seen by an on-duty police officer who had also stopped at the same 7-Eleven. Both Nicole and Chris had called Jean's phone around 7 p.m. without getting an answer. Nicole had called because she wanted to tell her mom not to expect her and Billy for dinner. It was Billy's last day in Nashua, and he and Nicole wanted to spend the time alone. When Nicole had not been able to reach her mom, she'd left a message on Chris's phone letting him know that she and Billy would be going bowling and then shopping at the local mall. The unanswered calls that both Chris and Nicole had made to Jean suggested to law enforcement that by 7 p.m., Jean was most likely already dead. As for the crime scene itself, Jean's attacker seemed to have made very little effort to cover their tracks. Whoever had killed Jean had left behind a partial bloody handprint on the refrigerator, suggesting that they had not worn gloves and may have left other DNA traces inside of the house. Police were also able to determine the kinds of weapons that had been used to kill Jean, even finding a piece of one weapon in the kitchen sink, and another weapon that the killer may have dropped outside. As for motives and suspects, initial interviews with Jean's neighbors had already turned up several possible leads, even though the neighbors gathering outside were all telling police the same thing, that Jean was genuinely and universally liked and even loved by her friends, coworkers, and acquaintances. It wasn't long before Nashua detectives Dennis Linehan and Richard Sprankle had added names other than Chris McGowan to their people of interest list. Neighbors immediately pointed to Jean's ex-husband, Anthony Kasinkas. Jean had said outright to several friends that she was afraid of him, and police would soon learn that Anthony had a criminal record for threatening a person by firing off a shotgun in their direction. And some neighbors even whispered that police should track down Jean's own son. Charlie had a reputation for hanging out with a bad group of kids and for such violent displays of temper that for a long time, Jean refused to keep any sharp knives in the house for fear that Charlie might attack her or his sister. Shocked by the violence of the scene, Detective Sprankle also wondered if the murder could possibly be related to gang violence, evidence of which had recently begun to surface in downtown Nashua, where certain walls and buildings had been covered with gang-related graffiti. And as Jean's children arrived at the scene, the feeling of shock and tragedy that now hung over the cozy Cape House just kept growing. Portable floodlights had turned the crime scene tape a neon yellow, and through the windows, Jean's neighbors could see the bulky shape of crime scene techs in protective clothing moving from one room to another. Charlie was the first of Jean's children to arrive. Emerging through the crowd outside his family home, he approached police, asking what was going on and where his mother and sister were. After being informed that his mother was dead, uniformed officers seated him inside of a cruiser and drove him to the police station where he waited for the arrival of his father, Anthony Kasinkas. As Jennifer Ballou watched the scene unfold from her house next door to Jean's, she felt her heart sink at the thought of Charlie's sister, Nicole. Nicole had babysat regularly for Jennifer, and the two had become close. Jennifer knew how difficult the last few years had been for Nicole, and even though Jean and Nicole had argued over Nicole's relationship with Billy, Jennifer also knew how much Nicole relied on and loved her mom. Already in a vulnerable place, Jennifer knew that Nicole's life was about to get much, much harder. By the time Nicole and Billy arrived at the house at about 10:15, Nashua police officers already had 4 suspects awaiting interrogation at the Nashua Police Department. They were also making room for a parade of neighbors who were there to give witness statements, each arriving in a separate police cruiser so no 2 witnesses could compare and possibly change their stories. It wasn't long before Nicole and Billy were also taken down to the station. With round, dark eyes, Nicole had stared at the house where she lived and where she had just been playing tag in the backyard 6 hours earlier. Nicole barely seemed to register Billy's quick kiss on her lips. A few minutes later, and she was sliding into the cool interior of a black and white cruiser headed to the Nashua police station 10 minutes to the south. After Nicole left, Billy remained at the scene with one of the police detectives. When Billy was young, his family's home had caught fire, and ever since then, as he told the investigator, he'd reacted with a lot of anxiety to the sound and sight of the flashing blue and red lights on emergency vehicles. Even though Billy did not know Nicole's family that well, as he and the detective chatted, Billy immediately agreed to help the police with their investigation, and by 10:30 p.m., he was happy to get away from the commotion and flashing lights at Nicole's house. He too was making the short trip south to a police station that now seemed to be overflowing with witnesses and suspects. For police detectives Linehan and Sprankle, it was a very busy night. Their main focus was on the interrogation of Jean's fiancé and her ex-husband, Anthony. Distracted and upset by the sight and feel of Jean's blood all over his bare arms, hands, and knees, as well as the patches of her blood that stained his shirt and shorts, Chris seemed to have a hard time concentrating on the questions, let alone accepting the fact that Jean had been murdered. Jean's ex-husband had given police permission to question Nicole and Charlie. Anthony himself was civil without being overly helpful. But once police had confirmed Anthony's alibi, they realized he did not seem to have any useful information anyway, and so from then on, he was present at the station only as the legal guardian of his two now motherless children. But even though investigators had ruled out Anthony as Jean's killer, they already knew they were making progress. Given the amount of physical evidence from the crime scene and leads from witness statements and their interview with Chris, they were confident that it would only be a matter of time and getting the forensics and autopsy reports before they identified Jean's killer. Still, they never expected that the breakthrough they were looking for would come so early in their investigation. And when the tip did come in, it came from a witness, not from a suspect. As Detective Linehan was out in the hallway looking for a larger room where Billy could wait for someone to take his statement, another detective, Mark Schaff, had noticed something interesting during the interview he was conducting with one of the witnesses. It was just a slip of paper, but it might be important. After describing his find to Detective Linehan, both investigators went still for just a moment. The air conditioning in the station was broken, and the heat from the day had been trapped inside, making everyone feel sticky and uncomfortable. Pulling his collar a bit looser, Detective Linehan decided this information was significant enough that he needed to follow up on it in person. By the time the sun rose 5 hours later on Thursday, August 7th, what the veteran detective was about to discover would become front-page headlines for weeks to come. Based on that conversation and follow-up interviews with other witnesses, here is a reconstruction of what happened to Jean Domenico on the evening of Wednesday, August 6, 2003, inside her home at 6 Dumaine Avenue. After arriving home from work at about 5:30, Jean rolled right into her usual routine, letting the dogs out to do their business in the backyard, collecting and sorting the mail, checking phone messages, and tidying up the house. By the time she sat down to relax on the living room sofa, Jean was more than ready to spend a few minutes doing nothing more than enjoying the smell of pizza wafting up from the boxes on the kitchen table. After this past week, when the house had felt so crowded with people and teenage emotions, she welcomed the quiet before Chris and eventually Nicole, Billy, and Charlie arrived for dinner. So, when Jean heard the front door open a few minutes later, she looked at her watch in surprise. Chris would not be here for another hour, and it seemed early for the kids to be home, and Jean's surprise only intensified when she looked up and recognized her visitor. While Jean had been settling herself on the sofa, her killer had been cutting through the parking lot off Deerwood Drive behind Jean's house. Once Jean's backyard was in sight, the killer hesitated, but only for a moment. The plan was in motion, and there was no real doubts about what had to be done. By the time the killer had walked along the side of the backyard and cut across the front yard to the front steps, the killer felt committed and ready. Flinging open the door, the killer stepped inside. After saying hello to a startled Jean, the killer continued walking past her into Charlie's first-floor bedroom. Reaching behind the door of that bedroom, the killer pulled out an aluminum baseball bat. Closing the door, the killer then walked back out to the kitchen, where Jean was now standing next to the stove, a puzzled look on her face. Stepping toward the open entrance from the kitchen into the living room, the killer stopped and, turning to face Jean, lifted the bat and gave it an experimental swing. "I hate the Yankees," the killer said, referring to New York's Major League Baseball team. At this, Jean, who loved baseball, relaxed a little and went back to sitting on the couch and offering a few observations about recent sports news. It wasn't until the cordless phone on the small table next to the sofa rang and the killer immediately reached over Jean to answer it that time suddenly seemed to rush forward in a blur. After just a moment of listening to the conversation, Jean was raising her voice in anger. And as she turned to walk into the kitchen, thinking that any kind of movement might help her collect herself after recognizing the caller on the other end of the line, the killer suddenly lunged forward toward Jean. Then the killer swung the baseball bat in the direction of Jean's head. But instead of delivering a single blow that would stun Jean or crush her skull, the bat missed Jean's head. Instead, it hit her straight across her back and sent her staggering against the wall. Shocked and hurt, Jean righted herself and turned to look back. But even as she did so, her attacker swung the bat a second time, and this time the bat hit Jean squarely on the back of her head, causing what the medical examiner would later describe as a large split in the bone of her skull. Still, not only did Jean stay on her feet, she fought back. A few seconds later, and the two of them had crashed onto the glass coffee table in the living room, snapping the wooden legs and showering the carpet with shattered glass. Despite her injuries, Jean would break free from her attacker 2 more times before her killer managed to dodge past her into the kitchen and grab a knife from the butcher block on Jean's counter. Rounding again on Jean, the killer struck. The first blow to Jean's upper right shoulder was so hard that the knife blade broke off from the wooden handle. Dropping the handle onto the floor, the killer reached again for the butcher block. Grabbing a second knife, the killer stabbed Jean twice in the throat before dropping that knife onto the kitchen floor. But as her attacker started to turn away, Jean picked the knife up and once again pushed herself to her feet. Shocked, her attacker watched as Jean tried to run towards them before slipping and falling in her own blood. As she fell, Jean's head bumped almost gently against her killer's side before hitting the plexiglass in the back door with enough force to push the panel completely out of its frame. Grabbing a third knife, Jean's killer straddled her fallen body and began stabbing, delivering more than a total of 40 blows to Jean's head, neck, back, arms, and hands before finally standing and looking down at her dark, blood-soaked hair and profile. Pausing before going into the bathroom to clean up, the killer listened as Jean struggled to breathe before speaking her final words. "Okay," she whispered, "I'm done." About 15 minutes after the killer had left the house, the back door at 6 Dumaine Avenue opened again. But this time, the visitor had to push hard enough to move Jean's body out of the way in order to enter the house. Once inside, the visitor looked down at the single mother of 2 lying in a pool of blood, and then very casually and carefully stepped over the body. Cleaning up the scene would be difficult, but the important thing was to avoid leaving footprints. So, picking their way through the splashes of blood that seemed to cover everything, not only the floors from the kitchen out through the living room, but also the walls and even the ceiling. The visitor was soon hard at work, scrubbing away handprints, gathering up the baseball bat and knives, and bundling everything, including bloody clothes the killer had left in the bathroom, inside a jacket. And then, straightening up and pushing her long dark hair out of her face, Jean Domenico's 16-year-old daughter, Nicole, gave a final look around the house. The smell of the pizzas on the kitchen table lost in the coppery scent of her mother's blood. Moving with the same care she had used coming into the house, Nicole once again stepped over her mother's body, and then, with a sigh of relief, Nicole closed the kitchen door behind her. Billy had done his part. He had kept his promise to Nicole that he would kill her mother so he and Nicole could be together for the rest of their lives, and now Nicole had done her part too. She had gone back to the house, cleaned up Billy's mess, and picked up the inhaler he needed to control his asthma. Earlier, when Billy had returned to the lot at the nearby 7-Eleven convenience store after killing Jean, Nicole had been waiting for him, reading a teen magazine she enjoyed while leaning against the hood of his black Chevy Cavalier. Nicole had been surprised by how much blood Billy still had on him, even after he had run upstairs before leaving the house to get a clean shirt out of the suitcase he had left in her bedroom. Nicole was also surprised at how angry and agitated Billy seemed. She'd known almost as soon as she called her home number, maybe 30 minutes earlier, and Billy had answered the phone, that her mother was still alive, because Nicole could hear her mother's voice in the background asking Billy if he was speaking to Nicole, and then hearing her mom plead directly with Nicole, asking her to please just come home. Nicole had had to shout at Billy to just do it, get it done, because how else would the two of them be able to start a life together unless Nicole's mother was dead? And Nicole had also known that her call to Billy had just made him upset. Still, it surprised her that once her mother was gone, that this reunion with Billy in the 7-Eleven parking lot wasn't more romantic and satisfying. And seeing all that blood on Billy, Nicole didn't really want to go back to the house, but Billy had made her, saying that cleaning up the murder scene had been Nicole's part of the bargain. It had been very hard stepping over her mother's body and not even being completely sure her mom was actually dead yet, but Nicole had done it, And then the two of them, Billy and Nicole, had driven to the Pheasant Lane Mall so Billy could clean up and get more clean clothes, and so they could get rid of the baseball bat, the knives, and those bloody clothes by dumping them at the deserted wooded edge of Overlook Golf Course located one town over. But once Nicole and Billy went back to the house at 6 Dumaine Ave, thinking they had committed the perfect crime and set up perfect alibis for themselves, everything started to fall apart. Nicole just had no way of knowing that later that night they would both be questioned by police and that some detective would notice the receipt for the new clothes Billy was wearing sticking out of Nicole's shirt pocket. And once that detective had started asking Nicole all kinds of questions about where she and Billy had been that afternoon and evening, it was impossible to keep all the lies straight. And soon the detective was talking to another detective who went and talked to Billy, and pretty soon the story Nicole told wasn't matching the story Billy was telling. And that's when Nicole just broke down in tears and told the detective everything that happened. Except that in Nicole's mind, even though it had been her idea to kill her mother, it was all Billy's fault because he was the one who actually did the killing. It would turn out that 3 days into Billy's visit to 6 Dumaine Avenue, Jean was so alarmed at the intensity of the relationship between Billy and Nicole that she told the two teenagers that Billy would need to end his visit early. She wanted him gone first thing in the morning on Thursday, August 7th. Jean also made it clear to Nicole that Jean was not interested in having Billy come visit again, or in letting Nicole go visit Billy. And after Billy's outburst at Jean during that family dinner on Sunday when Billy accused Jean of insulting Billy's mother, Jean had also begun to suspect that not only was Billy manipulating Nicole, he also had serious anger issues. What Jean had no way of knowing was just how correct those suspicions were. Ever since the age of 5, Billy had shown signs of depression, anxiety, and bipolar disorder, a mental health condition that causes major mood swings. Billy had also been hospitalized at least 5 times for psychiatric problems, including an episode in which he had attacked his mother with a baseball bat. The agitation that police noticed in Billy when he and Nicole appeared at the crime scene on the night of August 6th may have been triggered by the bad memories he associated with flashing emergency lights, but it was also a physical symptom that indicated he was not taking the medications prescribed to treat his mental illness. In the 15 months since Nicole had met Billy online, Nicole and Billy had held a mock wedding ceremony, and by late 2002 had begun referring to one another as husband and wife and Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan. They also had both written letters to Jean asking that she allow Nicole to move to Connecticut and live with Billy. And when Jean said no, absolutely not, Nicole and Billy started talking about other ways to be together. Running away to another state, or getting Nicole a legal separation from her family. And even though Billy had at least one other girlfriend besides Nicole, he and Nicole made lists of what they would buy for their new apartment and life together. When Jean finally put her foot down and told Nicole and Billy on Monday, August 4th that they needed to end their relationship, the two teenagers would spend the next 3 days conspiring to kill Nicole's mother, the one person who stood between them and their dreams of the life they would spend together. In the early morning hours of August 6th, seated in separate interrogation rooms at the Nashville Police Department, Billy and Nicole each confessed to the brutal murder of Jean Domenico. In all, the life they had dreamed of together had lasted less than 5 hours, and the last time Billy and Nicole kissed or saw each other until their cases went to trial was just outside the house at 6 Dumaine Ave, where Jean's body would remain lying in its pool of drying blood until the next day. The news of Nicole's arrest stunned not only her family, but everyone who had known Jean. But that was not the last of Nicole's revelations. It would turn out that Nicole and her boyfriend had made 4 previous attempts on Jean's life in the days leading up to the murder. First, they had laced her coffee creamer with over-the-counter drugs and then with bleach. Neither attempt at poisoning worked. The drugs caused the episodes of dizziness that Chris would later blame on Jean's restrictive diet. The smell of bleach made Jean throw the creamer away without drinking any of it. The third murder attempt, starting a fire in Jean's bedroom and then locking Jean inside, failed when the flame-retardant mattress in Jean's bedroom would not catch fire. Their fourth attempt to kill Jean by running a gasoline-soaked length of rope through an outside window into the oil tank and then setting the rope and eventually the oil inside the tank on fire ended when Chris came out of the house and saw them. Panicking, Nicole threw the rope into a nearby garbage can. By Wednesday afternoon, August 5th, Billy and Nicole had decided to kill Jean with the baseball bat they knew was behind the door of Charlie's bedroom. They would create alibis with the story they told Chris about spending the dinner hour at the local bowling alley, and they also assumed the police would suspect that Jean was the victim of a robbery gone wrong. On March 28, 2005, almost 1.5 years after Jean's murder, Nicole avoided a charge of first-degree murder by pleading guilty to lesser charges of second-degree murder and agreeing to testify against the love of her life, Billy Sullivan. Nicole was sentenced to a minimum of 35 years in prison. 4 months later, on July 15th, after an unsuccessful attempt to plead guilty by reason of insanity, Billy was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. After Jean's murder, Nicole's brother, Charlie, went to live with his father, Anthony Kasinkas. Birch Elementary School in Nashua, where Jean had once worked as a volunteer, member of the parent-teacher organization, and a teacher's aide, dedicated a granite bench in her honor that stands outside the school's entrance. On May 22, 2004, the city of Nashua renamed one of its Little League baseball fields the Jean Domenico Ballpark.
Eric Martin was working at a paper mill in Maine, and he had been working at this paper mill for 20 years, and he was reaching up to get something on a shelf when he threw his back out. And in fact, he had slipped a number of discs, and it ultimately meant he was not able to work anymore. He was going to be disabled. And so he's suddenly out of work. His wife, Shelly Martin, was not working at the time, but when he couldn't work, she needed to get a job. And so Shelly, who had not worked in a long time, was able, through some connections, to land a job in her hometown in Maine called Palmyra. Palmyra was a very small, rural community. I mean, we're talking maybe 1,200 people that lived there. They also had a 17-year-old daughter named Chelsea who was not eager to go, but it was the only place they could afford, and so they had to go. Luckily, because Palmyra was such a cheap place to live relative to where they had been living, that for less money, they actually ended up getting a bigger piece of property than they had lived in before. It's this beautiful farmhouse that sat on a whole bunch of acreage, but it was incredibly isolated. You had to go down this bumpy access road to get to their long driveway, and then once you were on the property, you'd look out and it was just a full 360 degrees of very dense forest that virtually no one was in. There was no nature trails. It was just dark, dense forest everywhere you looked. So even though no one's that happy about it, they end up moving into this farmhouse, and as they're unpacking their truck, Eric picks up one of his many rifles that he owned. Eric came from a long line of hunters. He loved to hunt. It was his favorite thing to do, and he had a whole bunch of guns that he kept. And as he's carrying the rifle into the house, Shelly says, "Oh no, we're not keeping the guns in the house. You have a barn, you're gonna put your guns in there." This had always been a point of contention for them in their marriage. Shelly just didn't feel safe having guns in the house, especially having kids in there. And so ultimately Eric agrees, okay, fine, I won't put my guns in the house. I'll put them in the barn. And so he went in the barn, and he and his son, Sean, who he had come out to help him, they built this gun case for all of his rifles. It was very heavy duty. They put it in the barn, and then they locked that and then locked the barn itself. So they were totally secure in the barn, but definitely not readily accessible. Over that first year, Shelly and Eric developed this ritual where at the end of the day, they would go out on the front porch of their farmhouse and look out onto the front yard, and they would drink coffee. It was something they both looked forward to, and virtually every night they did did this. And so almost exactly a year after moving in, it was in early 2006, Shelley and Eric are sitting on their front porch, enjoying their coffee, they're chatting, and Shelley thinks she sees something in the woods. Now, you have to understand the layout and how far away they are from the woods to get a sense of what they were seeing. Right in front of their porch was a gravel road where they parked their cars. About 20 meters away from their house to the left is their barn, and beyond the barn, basically straight out from the porch, is this huge open field where there's no trees or anything. It was like open grazing area. And then way beyond the field was the beginning of this tree line, of this really dense forest. So we're talking at least a couple hundred meters away where she sees these lights. And she described it as like a pulsating light. It did not look like a car or some sort of vehicle, not to mention there was no road out straight ahead from their porch. It was just a dense forest where there was absolutely no one that should have been in there. Eric immediately, when he sees the lights, he thinks there's a poacher on his property, someone illegally hunting on his property. And so he gets Sean, his son, who did not live with them but was staying the night that night, he gets him to come outside and say, hey, do you think that's a poacher down there at the edge of our tree line? And Sean's like, I don't know, maybe. Eric decides that he wants to go tell this person to leave his property. And so he asked Sean to come with him. They figured they would just get to the edge of the property and yell out, hey, this is private property, you need to leave. As they're walking across the field and they're getting closer to the tree line, the lights, those pulsating lights, begin to fade and disappear back into the woods. And they get all the way up to the tree line and they can't see any lights at all. Even though at this point, standing on the edge of the forest, Eric and Sean are fairly confident that this poacher has left, they decide, just to be sure, let's walk a little ways into the woods. Even though it's totally dark, we're not going to get lost. We'll walk a little ways into the woods and just continue to yell, this is private property, so they really do leave. And so they begin walking, and it's a very dense forest, lots of low-hanging limbs. It's not somewhere that's easy to walk. There's no walking trails or anything like that. And they walk, 10, 15 meters into the woods, and then they hear what sounds like someone walking parallel to them, maybe 15 meters away from them on their left. And they both stop and they look. They didn't want to take any chance that they were being stalked by a predator. And so they thought, you know what? The lights are gone. I don't know what animal this is. Let's just get out of here. About a month goes by and Nathan, who is Chelsea's boyfriend, was staying with the family at the farm. And it was the first nice spring day. I mean, it was a very dark and dreary winter. Maine winters tend to be that way. And so that weekend, Nathan and Chelsea decide, let's go walk around the woods. So they take the two family dogs and they start walking across that big field in front of the house into the forest, the same area where Sean and Eric have been looking for those lights and then heard what sounded like an animal that was near them. And so at first, Chelsea has the dogs on leashes, but they get to the forest and she lets them off their leash to let them go run around and go crazy because they've been cooped up because of the wintertime as well. The two dogs instantly take off running for about 100 meters and then they come to a dead stop right outside this big mound. It looks like a dirt mound, but they get up close to it and they can tell that it's actually more like a den. There are these huge pieces of wood that have been leaned into like a lean-to type structure with moss and dirt and grass put all over the outside. I mean, it looks like a very intentionally made mound. And there's a circular hole that's been created right on the front of it. And the dogs have stopped right outside and they're poking their heads in and smelling into this hole. And Nathan and Chelsea are looking at this thinking, who did this? Is this like a hunter's thing? Is this something a hunter might make? Would an animal make this? This seems really big for some animal to make this, but it definitely was made on purpose, whatever it is. And so Nathan, he just kind of looks down into this den, but it's totally dark, and he thinks he hears growling coming from inside of the den. And so without any hesitation, he goes, we gotta go. I don't know what's living in there, but we gotta go. And so they take the dogs, they put them back on leashes, and the two of them get out of the forest as quickly as they can. When Nathan and Chelsea came back to the house, they told Eric and Shelley, and actually Sean was there too, and they said, hey, we found this den of some kind out in the middle of the woods, basically straight out from your front porch. And that's when Eric and Sean said, well, about a month ago, we were out in that same area, and we could have sworn we heard some animal stalking us. A couple of months go by and Eric and Shelley are sitting on their front porch having their coffee ritual, and there was just this low mist that kind of hung over the entire field. And as they're sitting there, they're commenting on how creepy it was. And what started as just kind of a friendly discussion about the general creepiness took a turn when they realized that they couldn't hear any wildlife. No crickets, no animals, no anything. And normally at night, because they were out here all the time, it was humming with life. And so Shelley had this high-powered flashlight that she always had out with her, and she starts scanning the property, not knowing what she's looking for, but it just seemed really odd that they couldn't hear any wildlife. But after she scans across the whole field, she doesn't see anything, and so she puts her flashlight down and just starts talking to Eric about whatever they normally talked about over coffee at night. Eric would say in numerous interviews that for whatever reason, when she put that flashlight down, he suddenly felt like they were in danger. He's looking out, he doesn't see anything, and then all of a sudden he just says, you know what? We gotta go inside. I don't know what it is, but we gotta go inside. And Shelly's like, come on, I wanna stay out here for a little bit longer. We'll go in a few minutes. And Eric stands up and he's like, no, go inside. And he tries to grab her to kind of push her into the house. And she's kind of fighting against him. And then all of a sudden, Shelly stops. And she goes, did you hear that? And Eric immediately knew that whatever it was, it's the reason he had that sudden feeling of being in danger. Eric turns around and he can't see anything because it's too dark. Shelly grabs her flashlight and she begins scanning the tree line. And she gets to the field and gets about halfway across the field right in front of them, and she stops. Because right in the middle of the field are 3 creatures that look like wolves. These huge creatures that are looking right at them. 2 others join them. So there's 5 wolf-like creatures that are staring at them right from the middle of their field. She says to Eric, what are those? And Eric, who's an experienced hunter, he has no idea. He goes, I think they're bears. They could be wolves. We gotta go inside. And so Shelly's just holding the light and they start charging directly at her so fast that she wasn't able to keep the light on them. They were already halfway across the field. They go inside, they shut the door, and they lock it. And without saying a word, the 2 of them make their rounds across the entire bottom floor, lock every window, close every blind, make sure everything is shut. There was something different about these 5 creatures. The way they started running towards them, it just felt like they were targeting Eric and Shelly. And so even after the house had been secured, they didn't feel safe. And so they're standing in the middle of their cabin, and Eric's saying, my guns are in the barn. We have no protection. And Shelly is like, whatever you do, do not go out there. We don't know what these are. It could be a bear, it could be a wolf, we don't know. Don't go out there. Shelly goes upstairs, she shuts off all the lights, she makes sure all the windows are shut. And then she goes to Chelsea's room, her daughter, and she wakes her up and she says, hey, come here, you gotta look at this. And they go to the window and they kind of like poke their head into the window because they don't want to like totally open it up and stare out because they don't want the creatures to see them. But they're kind of poking their head out the window and she's like, look. And standing on the gravel are these 5 creatures that are just standing in a row looking directly at the house. It was like they were waiting for them to come out the front door. They were just patiently standing there looking at the house. It did not look like normal animal behavior at all. And as she's looking, one of the animals looks up at Shelly in the window, and the creature stands on its 2 legs. It gets on its hind legs and looks at her, and Shelly gasps and falls over because the creature's like 8 feet tall. And so Shelly's on the ground looking at Chelsea, and she can't believe what she just saw. It's like her brain can't process that this creature, one, had even seen her. They barely had their head up in the window. But that it stood on its hind legs, that it was so big. What are they doing? Sitting in a row right on the outside of the house waiting for us? What's going on here? And so Shelly tells Chelsea, get in your bed, don't go to your windows, don't leave this room. And that's when Shelly also remembers that she hasn't heard her 2 dogs. And she's worried they might be outside. And so she starts quietly walking all along the top floor looking for her dogs. She's calling to her 2 dogs and they don't come out. Goes into the master bedroom and finds her 2 dogs hiding in the corner of the room next to each other. Like they're startled by whatever it is outside. Meanwhile, Eric was pacing downstairs thinking he needed to go to the barn and he needed to get his guns to protect the family. But he knew that between his own disability, he can barely walk very fast and he'd have to unlock the barn and then he'd have to pull down the gun case, unlock that. All the while he's exposed to these animals that are out there. And so the next best thing in his mind is maybe he could run outside, get in his truck and back the truck up to the front door, and then he could get his wife and his daughter to come out, jump in the car, and they could drive away. So he just goes to the window and he pulls the blinds aside to look outside, and those 5 creatures are now gone. They're not sitting on the gravel path right in front of the house. He doesn't know where they are, but they're not in front of the house. And so he closes the blinds and he's like, well, I don't know where they are. It's too dangerous to go out there. He starts pacing some more and he goes back to look and he sees them back in the field where they first saw them, all 5. You can see all 5. They're facing the house still, but he can see them because the moon has now popped through and he's got illumination on the field and he can see all 5. And he's like, okay, maybe if I just keep my eye on them, I can open the door, run out, get the car, back it up without them seeing me. And so without telling Shelly, he opens the door and he goes onto the front porch and he sees them out in the field. He's got a good line of sight on them. Quiet as he can, he walks down the steps and he makes his way over to his truck, which is about 10 meters away. And as he's getting closer and closer to his truck, he's got his eye on the creatures that are in the field. They haven't moved. They apparently haven't seen him. He gets to the driver's side of his truck and he's got his keys out and he's kind of fumbling to hit the unlock button, and then his motion sensor light kicks on. And he's so on edge being out there, when the light kicks on, he drops his keys because he's so startled. And the first thing he does, he looks towards the field and he sees that one of the 5 creatures is now standing on its hind legs looking at him directly. Before he even bends down to get his keys, he sees them all running towards him. He reaches down, he grabs his keys, he runs back to the house as fast as he can, and he gets inside and slams it right as he can hear them crossing the gravel right in front of the house. And he hears them bound onto the porch and start running around the wraparound porch. He's too scared to even look in the window, so he ducks down to get out of view. Shelly, who was upstairs, can hear everything going on, and she yells, "Eric, what's going on?" And he goes, "Stay up there, stay up there." Shelly, Eric, Chelsea, everyone's just frozen, waiting, knowing that these creatures are right on the other side, walking along his wraparound porch. And after a while, he hears the footsteps of these creatures leave the porch and go back onto the gravel area. And at some point, he pokes his head up and he looks, and all 5 are sitting there just facing the house, waiting for them to come out of the house. And so he scurries up the stairs to where Shelly and Chelsea are, and they just are so scared. So they decide they gotta call the police. If nothing else, the police will drive up and their vehicle might scare away these creatures. But on the phone, Shelly lets on that what they're really scared about is something on their property. In fact, it's 5 creatures, things running around outside their property. And immediately the police officer who's responding to this, he's like, "All right, well, are you sure it's not a moose? Are you sure it's not a bear?" And finally she's like, "No, can you please just come over here?" And he's like, "Listen, ma'am, just keep your door shut, keep your windows shut, and I'm sure it'll be fine." And ultimately that's how the call ends. They're on their own. The family felt helpless, and Eric especially felt really frustrated because he can't protect his family. He doesn't have a weapon, he can't get to his vehicle, they're just trapped. And so they decide the only thing we can do is barricade ourselves inside of the house. And so for the next 30 minutes, they put heavy furniture in front of all the doors and the windows. They blocked everything as best as they could. They got kitchen knives and they got an axe that they had inside to chop some wood. And so they go upstairs, they lock themselves in the master bedroom with their weapons and their dogs, and they get on the bed and they just decide all we can do is wait until the sun comes up. During the time they were barricading their house, they would look out from time to time and they would see the 5 creatures just sitting on that gravel area right in front of their house, just waiting for them. When they finally went upstairs and barricaded themselves in that room, they immediately heard the creatures move off of the gravel, and they heard a couple of them at least walk onto the porch and start pacing around the porch. And it's totally silent besides the sounds of these creatures. And they were clearly communicating with each other. They were bumping into walls and then they were howling at each other. There was clear communication happening where they were trying to coordinate some sort of attack on the family. Now, the way the house was set up is there was a second floor roof, and then the first floor was a little bit wider than the second floor and had its own kind of separate roof. And after a while, the creatures stopped walking on the porch. They left the porch and it's just silence. And then they would hear them jump onto that first roof. The scary thing about this is that if you walked around the roof, you could actually look into the second floor windows. And so they're laying there and periodically they'd be looking out their window. There was windows on either side of the room they were in, but there was a thin curtain between them and the window. And so from time to time, these creatures would walk past their windows and they would stop, they'd put their paws up onto the window and they would look inside. But there was a very thin sheet between them and the glass, so they couldn't see the creature and the creature couldn't see them. All night they're listening to these creatures running around, and sometimes they'd hear really loud scratching, like they had figured something out and they were trying to burrow their way into the house. But after a whole night of this, they never actually broke the glass, they never got inside the house. As the sun started to come up in the morning, the creatures jumped off the roof and they could hear them running away. And for about an hour they didn't hear anything outside. The sun's come up and they felt safe again. And so they left their room, they go downstairs, and they finally open it up, and all over their property are signs of huge creatures that had been on their property. Massive footprints with huge claws at the end. They found tufts of hair that had gotten caught on fence posts. And even scarier is they found all these points on the house, in particular on the second floor when they were walking on that roof, where there was clear markings that they had tried to burrow into the house. There were these deep-seated scratch marks into the side of the house. The front door had been scratched apart. I mean, it was very clear that whatever these creatures were, they were trying to get into the house, but they had just been unsuccessful. This experience was so traumatic for the family that they sold the house and they moved very quickly after that, and they have not experienced anything like that since they left. So what do you think those creatures were? Was that a bear, a wolf, or something else? Let me know in the comments what you think, and I will get back to all the early commenters. So get in there and give me your best theory. If you enjoyed this video and you haven't done this already, please waterboard the like button and subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram